This is that Walter Mitty, Nigel Mumford, now wearing an SAS beret. When I joined in 1974, there was 4 squadrons: A Squadron, B Squadron, D Squadron and G Squadron. Each squadron was split into 4 troops: Mobility Troop, Freefall Troop, Mountain Troop and Boat Troop. Each individual trooper had 2 or 3 skills. For example, you could be a demolitions expert, a radio operator, a medic, and some of the lads were interpreters. So you were given these skills as a SAS trooper. The whole idea of the SAS at the time was a NATO role of finding a way to get behind enemy lines and destroying Scud missiles in Russian-held territory. To do this is why they need the Mountain Troop, Boat Troop and Freefall Troop and Mobility Troop to get behind enemy lines in a secretive manner so that we could destroy these Scud missiles. In Hereford, on the parade square was a clock tower, and on the clock tower were the names of all SAS soldiers that had been killed in action or during training. I decided to join Boat Troop because my favourite sport was whitewater canoeing, and I thought my skills as a canoeist would be welcomed in Boat Troop, so I joined Boat Troop. The SAS were involved in a secret war fighting in the Oman, and because of this, skills hadn't been practiced for a long time. So when I got back to Hereford from my first tour in the Oman, I was involved with exercises with Boat Troop, and this is what I'll talk about now. They were a fucking disaster. We entered into the SAS storeroom and found dry suits. These dry suits had been wrapped up for a few years, and talcum powder had been put on them to try and preserve them. But trying to put them on, 2 suits that I tried, they just ripped. The rubber was perished, not serviceable. But eventually found one that didn't have a tear in it, and the other lads had the same problem, trying to find one that was serviceable. So we also then got inflatable boats that were packed and Johnson 40 engines and set off down to Poole Harbour to Royal Marine Base at Poole Harbour. There, the inflatables were taken out of the packaging, and the sergeants had forgot how to assemble them and were having trouble putting the floorboards in, but that's another story. Once they got them inflated, they attached the Johnson 40 engines and the petrol tanks and tried to start the engines. The instructors were knackered trying to start these engines. They just would not fire up. Royal Marine was laughing and came down with a can of quick start. He sprayed that into the air intake on the engine, and the next pull on the engine started the engines. So we eventually got the boats running. Great embarrassment, because the Royal Marines were laughing at us for sure. We were given a briefing that we'd do a beach landing, practice beach landings. So we'd set off down Poole Harbour, lay off an anchor near a beach. A diver would go in, do a recce on the beach, looking for mines and sentries, and then return to the boats. If everything was okay, the boats would go in. So that was the briefing. The instructions for the diver was that if he got into trouble, he would come to the surface and put his arm up. A boat would then go in and rescue him. And lo and behold, after a few minutes swimming, he came to the surface and put his arm up. So a boat had to go in and rescue him. Well, one thing you don't do with an inflatable boat is, when you're trying to rescue somebody, is put your boat broadside to the waves and try and pull somebody out of the water. The next wave that came along flipped the boat over with rifles, machine gun, a very expensive compass, everything fell into the sea to be in Davy Jones's locker, and even the boat was written off. So another boat went in to try and rescue now 5 guys swimming around in the water. So the boat goes in, and another wave hit him and took out the engine. The engine wouldn't start. So eventually I decided I would go in, and with my experience I pointed the boat into the waves and let the waves push me to the men that needed rescued. And every time a wave came, I would throttle up, get over the wave, and then keep the boat straight until I reached the men. I reached them, got them in my boat, and pulled them to safety. The reason the diver got into trouble was the undercurrent. You could hear the waves pounding on the pebble beach, and the pebbles were making such a noise. It was obvious a beach that was not wrecked beforehand. What a stupid place to try and attempt a beach landing. But there was many more cock-ups to come. Going back to Poole Harbour, the sergeant in charge, instead of going down the channel, he ordered me to take a straight beeline into Poole Harbour. I shouted out, "But there's rocks there." He says, "Do as you're told." So as a British soldier, you do as you're told. I knew there'd be problems. And then the boat I was towing ended up on top of my boat when a wave lifted it up and planted it there. One of the lads fell in the water, and because his dry suit was torn and the seal broken, he filled up with water, and I couldn't pull him into the boat to rescue him. So he had to slash the dry suit with his knife so I could get him into the boat. In the end, we were rescued by the Navy. What an embarrassment. What a day. Anyway, the next couple of days later, we were told that we were going to rig the boats up and throw them out of a C-130 and dive after them with free fall chutes and practice that way of getting into the water. What could possibly go wrong? The wind was too strong. The sea had a 2-meter swell, and we've never done this before. It was comical. We pushed the boat out of the C-130 and you had to jump after it. Now, I was the last one out of the aircraft, so the last one out has farther to swim. And once you reach the boat, you have to de-rig it, take the parachutes off, put the engine on the back, and go and pick the lads up who have not made it to the boat. And the current got me, so I couldn't swim to the boat. I was on my way to France, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, I don't know French. General de Gaulle, Eiffel Tower, cul-de-sac. I was laughing to myself. I said, this is a fucking joke. I had a parachute, and if we were told that if you lost your parachute, you'd have to pay for it because there was expensive freefall parachutes. Again, the British Army. But eventually, one of the lads had managed to get to the inflatable, start the engine with a quick start, and managed to come and rescue it. I took over the steering of the inflatable, and we had to RV with a landing craft, Royal Navy landing craft, and with this swell 2 meters, if you know the door on a landing craft, it's a really thick, heavy metal door, and I'm watching. Then the landing craft would go up on the swell, and the door came crashing down, and we got to get on there, and never practiced in gentle water. I mean, see, it was the first time trying to get on a landing craft with a 2 meter swell on it. And my first attempt, one of the lads tried to jump onto the door of the landing craft, and he missed his footing. and ended in the water. He was nearly killed by the door of the landing craft. So I managed to pull him back on the inflatable, and I says, the only way we're going to do this is get the timing right, rev the engine up, and just drive straight up that blinking door. And that's the only way I got on that landing craft. But I did damage the engine because I didn't know how to take off the release on the outboard motor. There was no instructors that were giving us the right information. We needed somebody in the SBS to come and work with Boat Troop SAS to teach us the skills. We did not have the skills that were needed. And those guys who had died in training, most of them had died drowning. And now I realized why. Financial cutbacks to the Ministry of Defence by the Labour government, which were really renowned for cutting back on the defence of the nation, were actually causing the death of soldiers. The other thing was that the Royal Marines didn't want to work with the Army, and the Army didn't want to work with the Navy. Why? Because the Ruperts didn't want it. But we needed SBS to work within the SAS to teach us their boat skills. But it just didn't happen.